Blue and red lights bounced across the lake. Karen stood on my dock, jabbing her finger at me while shouting at the deputy she had dragged out here. "This dock breaks HOA rules," she screamed so loud the whole neighborhood could hear. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. While she thought I was just some old man with a few fishing poles, I had something she could never fight proof. Not just for this dock. Not just for my land. For the entire lake her HOA pretended to control. The judge didn't scold me when he saw it. He laughed. Karen had no idea she had just started a fight with the one person who could sink her entire empire. She thought calling the cops would end my story. She didn't know it was only the beginning. That dock wasn't just wood and nails. It was where my dad first taught me to fish. Where my wife and I sat together and watched the sunset turn the water gold. Where my grandkids caught their first bluegill. Every inch of it held family, memory, and history. My grandfather bought this land decades before Heron Cove Estates even existed. He left it to my father and then to me. Along with it came something people like Karen never understand: responsibility. So when I came home from a weekend with my daughter and saw Karen screaming at the deputy about illegal construction, I knew exactly what was happening. She never checked records. She never asked questions. She simply decided my dock didn't fit her perfect picture. But the truth was older than her entire neighborhood. She thought she could scare me with fake fines and police reports. She didn't realize I carried proof that would flip the whole lake upside down. And the moment I opened my mailbox, I found the first clue that her game was bigger and dirtier than anyone imagined. It was a bright Saturday morning when it all went down. The kind of morning made for coffee on the porch and a quiet hour by the water. The sun was still climbing, the lake rippling with soft waves, and I had just pulled a folding chair to the edge of the dock when I heard the sound. Not birds, not the hum of a boat engine. It was the sharp clack of high heels on gravel. Karen. She marched straight down the path like she owned it, her sunglasses pushed high on her head and a stack of papers clutched in her hand. Even from a distance I could hear the tone, that tight, cutting voice that carried over the water like a rusty saw blade. "You can't be here. This structure violates community codes," she yelled, waving the papers as if they were the 10 Commandments. I didn't move. I didn't even set down my coffee. "This is my dock," I said calmly. That only made her louder. "You are part of Heron Cove Estates, and that means you follow our rules. Your dock is not approved. Your fishing is not approved. Nothing about this mess is approved." She was practically foaming at the mouth. I stood slowly, brushing the dust off my jeans. "Ma'am, this dock was built long before your HOA existed." That's when she smirked. "We'll see what the sheriff has to say." She pulled out her phone and dialed right in front of me, her voice suddenly turning sweet, like she was placing an order at a restaurant. "Yes, hello. I need an officer at Lakeshore Drive. We've got an illegal structure and a belligerent trespasser refusing to leave." Within minutes, the sound of tires on gravel broke the quiet. A sheriff's cruiser rolled up beside the lake, lights flashing in the bright morning sun. Karen stood taller, fixing her hair like she was about to win a beauty contest. The deputy stepped out, squinting at the scene. He looked from me to Karen, then at the dock, then back again. His face said it all. He had no clue why he'd been called. "Sir," he said carefully, "we got a complaint about unauthorized construction." Karen cut in before I could answer. "This man refuses to remove his illegal dock. He is ignoring HOA citations and disrupting the neighborhood's lakefront." The deputy frowned. "Ma'am, this dock looks like it's been here for years." "That doesn't matter," she snapped. "The board voted to enforce removal, and he is in violation of our bylaws." The deputy turned to me, waiting for a reaction. I just smiled. "Officer, I'm happy to show you my paperwork. In fact, I encourage it. But right now, you should know something important." Karen crossed her arms, certain she had won. The deputy raised his eyebrows. "And what's that?" I leaned against the railing of my dock, letting the silence stretch. "This isn't just a dock. This is deeded land. My family has owned this shoreline longer than Heron Cove Estates has existed, and as for their bylaws," I let my voice trail off, steady and calm, "they don't apply to me." The deputy's eyes flicked from Karen's smug face to my steady one. He didn't say a word, just scribbled something on his notepad. Karen's smile faltered for the first time. She thought calling the cops would scare me into backing down. What she didn't know was that this was only the first move in a much bigger game, one she couldn't possibly win. The deputy drove off without giving Karen the victory she wanted, but I knew this wasn't finished. She wouldn't stop with one call. People like her never do. They double down. They make paperwork their weapon. That's why the first place I checked was my own mailbox. It was stuffed full after my weekend away, junk flyers, credit card offers, and right in the middle, two official-looking envelopes stamped with the Karen HOA Estates HOA logo. The first one was bold in red letters, "Final Notice." I tore it open. Inside was a letter claiming I owed 6 months of HOA dues and late fees, totaling nearly $3,000. My eyes narrowed. I wasn't a member of their HOA. I never signed their covenant. My property line ended a quarter mile before their subdivision even began. The second envelope was worse. It contained minutes from an HOA board meeting. A section had been circled in red ink. The board had voted, without me even knowing, to annex my shoreline into the association. Their reason? To preserve aesthetic cohesion of the community lakefront. In plain English, they didn't like the way my dock looked in the background of their backyard barbecues. My stomach turned cold. This wasn't a mistake, this was a land grab. I drove into town and went straight to the county records office. I'd worked with these clerks for years back when I was fire chief, and I trusted their files more than anything Karen could wave around. A woman at the desk greeted me with a polite smile. "Morning, Jack. What can I help you with?" I slid the letters across the counter. "Can you check if Karen HOA Estates has any jurisdiction over my property? Parcel number's still the same as my dad's deed." She typed quickly, the clack of the keyboard filling the silence. After a moment she frowned. "Strange," she muttered. "According to our system, your land is its own parcel. It's never been listed under Karen HOA Estates. Taxes are current. No liens. No annexation filings." I held up the letter. "Then what's this about annexation?" Her frown deepened. She clicked a few more tabs, then finally shook her head. "Not valid. The HOA has no authority to expand their boundaries. Only the county commissioners can approve annexation, and I'm not seeing anything filed. If they claim otherwise, it's forged." Forged. The word hit me harder than I expected. It meant they hadn't just bent the rules. They had broken the law. I thanked her and stepped outside, the sunlight suddenly sharper on my face. My dock was older than their bylaws, my deed older than their neighborhood, but they'd taken a vote in a room full of neighbors and decided my property belonged to them. And then they'd put it on paper, like it was fact. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table with the two envelopes spread in front of me. My late father's old deed was in a frame on the wall, proof that this lake frontage had been in our family for generations. The ink on that deed was older than Karen, older than her HOA, older than every rule they tried to wave in my face. Still, I wanted more than my word against theirs. So I dug through the old filing cabinet where I kept every permit, every inspection, every note from the day I built that dock. At the very back, under a stack of tax receipts, was a manila folder with the original county permit from 22 years ago. Stamped, signed, official. I compared it to the HOA's letter. One was real. The other was a bluff dressed up as law. But here's the part most people don't know, and this is where my training as a fire chief kicked in. Land along water isn't like land in a neighborhood street. It's governed by something called riparian rights. If you own the shoreline, you don't just own the dirt under your feet, you own the access to the water, the right to build a dock, the right to fish, and sometimes even the water itself if the deed says so. HOAs can make rules about lawn paint and mailbox colors, but they can't erase riparian rights that are older than their charter. That was my leverage. That was my shield. Still, I couldn't shake the anger. They hadn't just tried to fine me, they had voted to redraw a boundary that wasn't theirs to touch. That was fraud. That was theft written in meeting minutes. I fired up my laptop and searched the county's public document portal. After 20 minutes of digging, I found exactly what I expected, the official map showing Heron Cove's subdivision line. Clear as day, my 12 acres and my shoreline were shaded outside the HOA's boundary. Then I compared it to the copy Karen had waved around last week, the one she'd shoved under my nose like a weapon. On hers, the line was shifted. My shoreline was scribbled in like an afterthought. They'd literally drawn me into their map. It was clumsy, it was obvious, but it was dangerous, because if I didn't fight back, it would stand. The sound of kids laughing drifted across the lake just then. Neighbors' children were splashing in the water, their parents setting up lawn chairs nearby. I watched them for a long moment, realizing none of them knew what their board had done. They thought the HOA protected them. They had no idea it was stealing from me, and by extension threatening the rights of everyone who lived here. Karen wanted this to be a simple fight about a dock. She didn't realize I'd uncovered something much bigger. And once I proved their documents were forged, I knew exactly where I was headed next. The courtroom. The thing about lies is, they always look solid on the surface. It's when you start peeling back the layers that they fall apart. I'd seen it 100 times as fire chief. Someone swears they followed every rule, until you open a drawer and find the truth sitting in plain sight. That's exactly how I approached the HOA's attack. If they wanted to turn this into paperwork, then paperwork would be their undoing. I pulled out the old metal filing cabinet in my back room, the drawers stuck from years of humidity, but I forced them open one by one. Inside were decades of records. Tax statements, insurance policies, even receipts from the lumber yard when I bought boards to build the dock. Near the bottom was what I really needed, a thick manila folder marked Dock 2. I laid everything out on the kitchen table. First was the construction permit, stamped and signed by the county office 22 years ago. It gave me full approval to build the dock exactly where it stood. Behind it was the original deed map, my property shaded along the shoreline. The ink was faded, but the lines were clear. This lakefront was ours, long before Heron Cove Estates was even a sketch on a developer's napkin. I sat back staring at the two documents side by side. If this went to court, these weren't just papers, they were weapons. Still, I wanted more than old signatures. I wanted undeniable proof that the HOA was lying when they claimed to have notified me. 5 years earlier, after a group of teenagers trespassed to fish off my dock, I had installed security cameras. They weren't fancy, but they were good enough. Motion activated, time-stamped and backed up to the cloud. I logged into my account, scrolling through months of clips. The little thumbnails rolled past like a flipbook deer nosing around my mailbox, mailmen stuffing envelopes, raccoons getting into the trash. But what I never saw, not once, was an HOA member walking up to post a notice on my door. Karen swore they'd left warnings. My cameras swore otherwise. I downloaded every clip, labeling them carefully. If this ever landed in front of a judge, I wanted the timeline clear, 6 months of footage, no signs posted. But the real dagger was still ahead. I had a copy of the annexation map. Karen waved at me. It looked official at first glance, but I knew better than to trust surface impressions. Every digital file carries fingerprints, metadata, dates, times, even the computer used to create it. I slid the USB drive into my laptop and opened the file properties. What I found made me sit back in my chair. The original map was filed 10 years ago by the county surveyor. That entry was clean, but a second modification was listed, saved only 4 months earlier, not at the county office but on a home computer registered to L. Roselle. Linda Roselle, the HOA president. The timestamp was after midnight on a Tuesday. She hadn't just forged paperwork, she had stayed up late at her own desk, editing a government file like it was her personal coloring book. I took a screenshot of the metadata and saved it in a folder labeled Evidence. Then I printed a hard copy for good measure. As I slid the paper into a binder, something slipped out of the folder, an old photograph tucked between the pages. I picked it up and my breath caught. It was a picture of my father standing on the half-finished dock. He was in his work boots, jeans rolled at the cuff, holding a fishing pole in one hand while pointing to the lake with the other. I was just a kid in the corner of the frame, grinning as if I'd discovered treasure. I hadn't seen that picture in years. For a moment, the paperwork, the forgery, the anger, it all faded. All I saw was the man who taught me to respect this water, who always said, "Jack, this lake will outlive us. Protect it." I ran my thumb along the photo's edge. Dad never cared about HOA rules or fancy bylaws. He cared about legacy, and that photo reminded me this fight wasn't just about a dock, it was about family, about history, about keeping our name tied to this lake, no matter who tried to erase it. I tucked the photo back into the folder, right behind the permits. Then I closed the binder with a firm snap. The evidence was stacked. Original dock permit, deed map showing my shoreline ownership, security footage proving no notices were ever delivered, metadata exposing the HOA president as the one who doctored county maps. And now, a photo tying me to this dock since the day it was built. It was more than enough to punch holes in Karen's story, but I wasn't ready to show my hand just yet. Evidence means nothing if you drop it in the wrong place. No, this needed timing, strategy, precision. So I poured myself a cup of coffee, set the binder on the counter, and stared out at the water. The dock stretched into the lake, sturdy as ever. Karen thought she could scare me with letters and threats. She had no idea the walls of her little kingdom were already crumbling. And soon I would make sure the whole courtroom watched them fall. Courtrooms have their own smell. It's a mix of old wood polish, coffee, and the nervous sweat of people waiting to hear their fate. I had walked into plenty of them during my years as fire chief, testifying about arson cases and building codes. But this time was different. This time it wasn't about someone else's house, it was about mine. Karen was already there when I arrived. She sat at the plaintiff's table in a sharp navy suit, her hair pulled tight, her posture screaming confidence. Beside her was a man in a gray suit who looked like he had been practicing his frown in the mirror all morning. The HOA's lawyer. His stack of papers was so tall it looked like he had brought the entire library with him. The moment she saw me, Karen's lips curled into a smug smile. She whispered something to her lawyer, and both of them chuckled like the verdict had already been written. I didn't bother glaring back. I just walked to my table, set down my single binder, and sat quietly. When the bailiff called the room to order, the judge entered, a middle-aged man with a tired face, the kind that's seen every trick in the book. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the docket, and sighed. "All right," he said. "Here in Cove Estates versus Jack Whitaker. Counsel, you may begin." The HOA lawyer stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and launched into a speech. "Your Honor, this case is simple. The defendant has constructed and maintained a dock on community shoreline property without approval from the association. He has ignored repeated notices and accrued fines, which remain unpaid. This is a clear violation of community covenants, and we request an immediate order for removal." Karen nodded so hard I thought her head might snap off. The judge held up a hand. "Slow down, counsel. Community shoreline property, you said?" "Yes, Your Honor," the lawyer replied smoothly. "Heron Cove maintains jurisdiction over all visible waterfront. It is essential for aesthetic cohesion." The judge's eyebrow twitched. Aesthetic cohesion. Interesting phrase. "All right, let's hear from the defendant." I stood slowly, carrying my binder to the lectern. I spoke calmly, my voice steady. "Your Honor, with respect, none of what you just heard is true. This dock was built in 2003 with a county permit, signed and approved. It sits on my private shoreline, which has been deeded to my family for generations. The HOA has no jurisdiction here. My taxes, permits, and deeds confirm that." I opened the binder and handed copies to the clerk, who passed them up to the bench. The judge flipped through them, pausing at the old deed map. The HOA lawyer cleared his throat. "Objection, Your Honor. This is misleading. The board voted to annex his parcel into the association last year. That makes him subject to our bylaws." The judge leaned back in his chair, staring over his glasses. "You annexed his land with a vote." "Yes, Your Honor," the lawyer said confidently. "The community determined it was necessary. He owes 6 months of dues and late fees totaling $3,000. The judge stared for a long moment, then to my surprise he chuckled. It wasn't a polite smile, it wasn't a cough-covered laugh. It was a full-bodied, head-shaking laugh that echoed through the courtroom. "Counsel," he said, wiping his eyes, "you're telling me this man owes you HOA dues because you took a vote in a clubhouse? That's not how property law works." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the spectators in the back. Karen's face flushed red. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering furiously, but the damage was done. I stepped closer to the bench. "Your Honor, if I may, there's more. Not only does the HOA lack jurisdiction, but the annexation documents they're waving around are forged. The official county map shows my parcel outside their boundaries. The version they submitted has been altered, and the metadata proves it was edited on a personal computer belonging to their president, Linda Roselle. I laid the printed screenshot of the metadata on top of the binder. The judge picked it up, scanning the page. His tired expression sharpened. "Forged?" he repeated. "Yes, sir," I said. "The original county record was filed 10 years ago. This version was modified 4 months ago, at 2 in the morning on a home computer. Not by the county, not by a surveyor, by the HOA president herself." The judge tapped the page with his pen. His voice dropped low. "That's a serious allegation." Karen jumped to her feet. "Lies? He's twisting everything." "Sit down, Miss Roselle," the judge snapped. His tone was flat, controlled, but deadly serious. She froze, slowly sinking back into her chair. The lawyer cleared his throat again, trying to recover. "Your Honor, even if there were irregularities, the fact remains. His dock disrupts community harmony. The board's vote was unanimous. He cannot simply ignore the collective will of the neighborhood." The judge closed the binder with a snap. "Counsel, the collective will of the neighborhood cannot rewrite county maps, cannot forge signatures, and cannot trespass on a man's deed. Unless you have something more than bylaws and wishful thinking, I suggest you tread carefully." The lawyer's face paled. Karen sat stiffly, lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just stood there, steady, letting the silence speak for itself. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Whitaker, I'd like you to provide certified copies of these permits and the original deed to the court. Once verified, we'll move forward with a formal inquiry into the annexation. For now, this hearing is adjourned." The gavel struck wood. Karen spun on her lawyer, hissing under her breath. She looked like a general watching her army break ranks. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Fear. As the crowd shuffled out, I packed my binder and walked toward the exit. My heart was calm, but my resolve was steel. The fight was far from over. They thought a vote could erase my rights. Now the court knew their map was dirty, and soon, the whole county would know just how far their lies went. The courtroom victory felt good, but I knew better than to celebrate too early. Karen wasn't the type to give up after one blow. People like her don't retreat, they regroup. They double down and they look for the next angle. If I wanted to stop this once and for all, I needed to prove this wasn't just about me. I needed to show that Heron Cove's HOA had been running the same game on others for years. So I started asking questions. The list the sheriff had slid across his desk came back to my mind. Half a dozen names, folks who had complained about the HOA in the past but never followed through. I decided it was time to pay them a visit. The first house belonged to a man named Paul Miller. He was in his late 50s, soft-spoken, with a tired look in his eyes. He invited me onto his porch, glancing around like he was afraid someone might see us talking. "Paul," I asked gently, "what happened with the HOA?" He sighed. "Fence line. I built one right on my property marker, paid for a survey and everything. 2 weeks later I got a notice saying it was 6 inches over the line. They fined me $2,000. Said if I didn't pay, they'd put a lien on my house. Did you fight it?" He shook his head. "I couldn't afford a lawyer, so I paid. My wife begged me to just make it go away. That was 3 years ago, and I've been bitter every day since." His voice cracked at the end. It wasn't just the money, it was the humiliation. I thanked him and moved on. The next stop was a woman named Janet. She was in her 60s, still working part-time as a nurse. She sat me down at her kitchen table and poured me coffee like we were old friends. "They got me over paint," she said. "Paint, Jack. I'd saved up to repaint my trim. Chose a shade of beige I thought was beautiful. Next thing I know, they're sending letters saying it's not on the approved list. Threatened to sue if I didn't repaint. Do you know how much that cost me? Another $3,000. She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "And my husband had just come out of surgery. We didn't have the fight in us. So we did it. I hate that trim every time I see it." I left her house with a knot in my stomach. By the time I finished the list, I had spoken to half a dozen neighbors. The stories were different, fences, boats, landscaping, but the pattern was always the same. The HOA would nitpick, threaten fines, and corner people until they gave in. One man had been forced to move his shed because it was visible from the street. Another family had been told to tear out a vegetable garden because it didn't fit the aesthetic. And each time, the victim said the same thing: it wasn't worth the fight. I took notes on every story, dates, fines, names of board members involved. I wasn't just building my case, I was connecting the dots. That's when I went back to see Sheriff Miller. He leaned back in his chair, listening as I laid out everything I'd gathered. When I finished, he rubbed his chin and gave a slow nod. "You're not wrong," he said. "We've had complaints about that HOA for years. Nothing formal enough to stick, but plenty of smoke. Folks come in, start to file, then back down. Scared of the legal costs, scared of retaliation. Karen and her crew count on that fear." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside were reports, handwritten notes from deputies, summaries of phone calls, copies of letters residents had brought in. "They're not supposed to do this," the sheriff continued. "An HOA's authority stops where the deed lines stop. But the problem is, most people don't know their rights. HOAs they use official-sounding letters and fancy legal language to trick folks into thinking they've got more power than they really do. It's a common scam." He leaned forward, his eyes hard. "You're the first one I've seen with the backbone and the evidence to push back." That word, scam, stuck with me, because that's exactly what it was. Here's the truth most people don't realize. An HOA isn't the government. They don't get to redraw boundaries. They don't get to invent rules that override property law. Their power is limited to the members who signed up for it. Anything beyond that? Fraud. Plain and simple. I walked out of the sheriff's office with that folder under my arm. The evidence was piling higher by the day. It wasn't just my dock, it wasn't just my shoreline, it was a pattern of bullying, intimidation, and outright lies. Karen's empire wasn't built on rules. It was built on fear. That night, I sat at my dining table, spreading all the files across the wood like pieces of a giant puzzle. My binder with the dock permits, the letters from the HOA, the metadata from Linda's midnight editing session, and now, the neighbors' stories, each one like another crack in the foundation. I looked out the window at the lake. The moonlight rippled across the water, calm and steady, as if mocking the chaos swirling around it. My dock stretched into the darkness, a symbol of everything they were trying to take from me. Karen thought this was about one man and one dock. She had no idea I was about to put the entire history of her HOA on trial. And the place I planned to do it was her own backyard, at the next HOA board meeting. The clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee and bleach. Beige walls, folding chairs, and a long table at the front, where the board sat like they were the Supreme Court. About 20 residents filled the seats, some bored, some curious, most just there because they felt like they had to be. And right in the center, wearing a navy blazer and that same smug smile, was Karen. She tapped her gavel against the table like she was presiding over a kingdom. "Order," she snapped. "Let's begin." I stayed in the back at first, silent. I let her drone through the agenda: flower bed requests, lawn citations, parking fines. She cut people off mid-sentence, dismissing them with the wave of her hand. It was the same pattern I'd seen in every neighbor's story. Finally she got to new business. That was my cue. I stood, chairs squeaked as heads turned. The room grew quiet. Karen's eyes locked on me, narrowing, but her smile didn't budge. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice dripping with false patience. "This meeting is for HOA members only. You have no standing here." I walked down the aisle, calm, binder under my arm. "I'm here as the owner of the property you tried to steal," I said evenly. I set a stack of packets on the board's table. Then I began handing them out to the audience one by one. Curious residents flipped through the pages, brows furrowing. "These are certified county records," I explained. "On page 1 you'll see my property line, clear and separate from Heron Cove Estates. On page 2 you'll find the original permit for my dock, stamped and signed 22 years ago. On page 3 the demolition notices you claim were delivered, yet my security footage proves they never were." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People whispered to each other, pointing at the maps and signatures. Karen's smile twitched, but she leaned forward. "This is highly irregular. None of these documents are verified." "They're public record," I said flatly. "Anyone here can check them with the county clerk. And if you turn to the last page you'll see something very interesting. Metadata from the so-called annexation map." I clicked the small recorder in my hand, letting the audio fill the room. Karen's own voice crackled through the speaker, confident, smug. "If he won't sell, we'll force him out. We'll make it make sense." Gasps echoed across the clubhouse. A man in the second row muttered, "She actually said that?" Another resident flipped through the packet again, shaking her head. Karen shot to her feet. "This is an invasion of privacy. This is stolen material." "Sit down," I told her calmly. "You said it in a public forum, and now your neighbors have heard it." For the first time, her mask cracked. The smile dropped, replaced by panic. The lawyer at the end of the table jumped in, tugging at his tie. "None of this is admissible. Even if it were, it doesn't matter. The HOA has full jurisdiction over this lakefront. This man owes dues, plain and simple." That's when I smiled for the first time all night. "You're right about one thing," I said. "Jurisdiction matters. So let me clear it up." I pulled out one more document and laid it on the table. It wasn't just the dock permit, it wasn't just the deed to my parcel. It was the purchase record from 20 years ago when the original developer went bankrupt. "I don't just own my shoreline," I said slowly, letting each word land. "I own the lake." Silence slammed down on the room. The lawyer blinked, color draining from his face. "That's impossible." "No," I said, tapping the paper. "When Thompson Development folded, I bought the assets no one else wanted. The easements, the roads, the mineral rights, and yes, the lake itself, every drop of it. Your entire community exists because of those easements. You drive on my roads. You draw utilities across my land, and you fish in my water." Residents started whispering louder now. A woman near the front clutched her packet with both hands. "You mean, if he owns the lake, then the HOA has no power here," I finished for her. "Their bylaws don't cross property lines, and their president has been lying to you for years." Karen tried to speak, but the words died in her throat. Her eyes darted left and right as the crowd's murmurs grew into angry voices. "You knew this?" one man shouted. "You knew he owned the water and you still went after him?" Another woman pointed at Karen, her face red with fury. "You've been stealing from us. You've been wasting our money on fake lawsuits." The lawyer held up his hands, trying to calm the storm. "Let's not jump to conclusions. This is far from settled." But the judge's laughter from earlier echoed in my mind. And now the residents saw what I had known all along. Karen's empire wasn't built on authority. It was built on lies. The room erupted into chaos. Some residents stormed out, others crowded around the packets, flipping pages, shaking their heads. Karen sat frozen, her gavel useless on the table in front of her. I stood tall, letting the noise wash over me. For months she had painted me as a stubborn old man fighting rules I didn't like. But tonight everyone saw the truth. She thought she controlled the lake. She thought she controlled the board. But the only thing Karen truly controlled now was her own downfall. And I hadn't even shown them the full extent of what was coming next. The room had gone silent after my words. It wasn't just silence, it was the heavy kind, where every person is holding their breath, waiting for someone else to break it. Karen sat frozen, her lips parted, her eyes darting from me to the documents in front of her. The lawyer shuffled his papers like a gambler who realized the deck was stacked against him. I let the silence linger, then I leaned on the table and spoke slowly. You see, this isn't new. This story started long before Heron Cove was ever built. It started with my grandfather. A few heads turned, people leaned forward, curious now. My grandfather bought this lake almost 80 years ago. Back then it wasn't a community asset. It wasn't a backdrop for real estate brochures. It was farmland, forest, and water. He worked 2 jobs to scrape together the money because he wanted one thing for his family, a piece of ground that couldn't be taken by anyone else. I could see the surprise in people's faces. Some glanced at Karen, then back at me. She looked like she wanted to vanish into the floor. When he passed, my father took over. He didn't just keep the land, he protected it. Every time a developer came sniffing around, he held firm. And when he handed it down to me, he made sure the paperwork was airtight. Deeds, mineral rights, water rights, every box checked, every line clear. I held up the purchase record, the one I'd pulled from my binder. This lake has been in my family for generations. The only reason you can drive your cars on those roads, the only reason water and sewer lines run to your homes, is because your original developer cut a deal with us. They didn't buy the land, they rented it. A ripple went through the room. Residents flipped through their packets again, scanning the lines. That's called an easement, I explained. An easement is permission to use land you don't own, under strict conditions. It's not ownership, it's not control, it's borrowed privilege. The lawyer tried to jump in. This is irrelevant. Easements are permanent fixtures once granted. I shook my head. Wrong. Easements are contracts, and contracts have terms. When those terms are violated, the easement can be terminated. That's not just my opinion, that's the law. Karen finally found her voice. You can't just take it back. The HOA has controlled this lakefront for years. We manage it, we regulate it, You bully people, I cut in. You find them, you harass them, you forge documents to take what isn't yours. That isn't management, that's fraud. And when you demolished my home and came after my dock, you crossed the line. You violated the terms of your easements. I straightened, pulling a final envelope from my folder. I held it high so the room could see. As of 8 o'clock this morning, my attorney filed a termination of easements with the county. That means, effective immediately, the HOA no longer has legal access to my lake, my shoreline, or my land. Your fishing club, evicted. Your lakefront aesthetic, gone. Your power, I typed the paper. Finished. The gasp that followed was loud and collective, like the whole room had been punched in the chest. One man stood up, pointing at Karen. You told us the HOA owned the shoreline. A woman in the front row clutched her packet. You said our dues went to lake upkeep. You lied to us? Karen stammered, her face pale. We had agreements. You had nothing, I said. What you had was my permission, and you lost it the moment you tried to erase my family's history. The lawyer slammed his hand on the table. This is outrageous. You can't strand an entire community like this. You'll be sued into bankruptcy. I looked at him calmly. I don't need to strand anyone. The residents are free to work with me directly, but the HOA, the board, the sham organization that's been stealing money under false pretenses, they're done. Murmurs turned to angry voices. People shouted over one another, questions, accusations, fear. What about our kids' fishing club? What about our dues? Where did they go? Are we even insured anymore? The noise grew louder, chaos swirling in the little beige clubhouse, and for the first time, Karen had no gavel strong enough to bring it back to order. I raised my voice above the din. Listen to me. Nothing stops you from enjoying the lake as neighbors. You'll still fish. You'll still swim. You'll still gather. But not under their control. Not under a false crown. From this point on, you answer to truth, not to lies. The lawyer's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what this meant. Without access to the lake, the HOA was nothing but a paper tiger. No dues, no leverage, no teeth. I let the moment stretch, watching the board squirm, watching the residents' faces shift from confusion to realization. Then I delivered the final blow. For the past 2 decades, Karen and her board pretended they owned this lake. They didn't. My family did, and today the paperwork makes it official again. The HOA is powerless. The lake is free, and as of this morning, the fishing club's lease is canceled. They have 48 hours to remove their gear from my shoreline. You could have heard a pin drop. Then the shouting started all over again, this time aimed squarely at Karen. You lied to us. You wasted our money. You said you had control. Karen tried to stand, but her legs wobbled. The lawyer's face had gone white. I closed my binder, tucking it under my arm. Karen thought she held the lake in her fist. Tonight, she learned the truth. The lake was never hers. It was mine. And this was only the beginning of her downfall. When you tear down a lie, it doesn't fall gently. It crashes like rotten wood, loud and messy, exposing everything that was hidden inside. That's exactly what happened after the board meeting. The residents who had once nodded along to Karen's orders were now furious. They confronted her right there in the clubhouse, waving my evidence packets in her face. Voices rose, chairs scraped, people demanded refunds of their dues. Some shouted about lawsuits, others about resignations. Karen tried to fight back, but every word sounded weaker than the last. Her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, but even he knew the tide had turned. Within a week, the HOA called an emergency vote. The residents, tired of the bullying and lies, voted almost unanimously to dissolve the board. The same people who once feared Karen now wanted nothing to do with her. But for me, that wasn't enough. I wanted accountability. I took everything I had: permits, deeds, the forged annexation file with Linda's name stamped in the metadata, and the audio recording of her bragging about forcing me out, and filed a formal complaint. Sheriff Miller met me in his office, his expression grim as he flipped through the evidence. "Jack," he said finally, "this isn't just a civil dispute anymore. This is criminal, forgery, wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy. This touches multiple statutes. I'll need to forward this to the state prosecutor." True to his word, things moved fast. 2 weeks later, deputies rolled up to Karen's house. Neighbors watched from their porches as she was led out in handcuffs, still shouting that it was all a misunderstanding. Her cries of innocence didn't carry the same weight anymore. Not when the entire neighborhood had seen the proof with their own eyes. The charges stacked against her like bricks. Forgery of government documents, fraudulent use of the mail to send fake notices, harassment and conspiracy. Her lawyer, once so confident in the courtroom, now looked like a man walking barefoot over broken glass. He couldn't spin forged signatures or doctored maps. Not when digital fingerprints tied the files directly to her personal computer. And as Karen's case moved into the criminal system, the HOA itself unraveled completely. Without dues, without leadership, without legal standing, the organization crumbled. Contractors canceled their agreements. The landscaping crew walked away. Even the security guard who liked to play pretend cop stopped showing up. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. No fines, no threats, just people figuring out how to be neighbors again. But my fight wasn't finished. I filed a civil suit against the HOA for damages. My dock had been threatened, my home nearly stolen through paperwork tricks, my reputation dragged through the mud, and more importantly, my family's legacy had been attacked. The case didn't take long. In front of the same judge who had laughed at the idea of me owing dock dues, I presented everything again, this time with Karen's arrest record added to the pile. The HOA, what was left of it, didn't even bother to fight. Their insurance company saw the mountain of evidence and settled before trial. The judge banged his gavel. "Mr. Whitaker, you are awarded full replacement value of your property, plus punitive damages." The number he read out loud almost didn't register at first. $948,000. Almost $1 million. It wasn't about the money, it was about what it meant. Proof that the system saw through their lies. Proof that what my father and grandfather had built wasn't just some old man's memory, it was untouchable. When the check arrived, I didn't frame it or gloat over it. I cashed it quietly, then hired a crew. Not demolition, but construction. The kind of crew that builds, not tears down. Day by day, my property transformed. The dock was restored. My house rose again, stronger, with reinforced beams and a storm shelter built into the foundation. Every nail hammered into place felt like justice, not just for me, but for every neighbor who had been bullied into silence. And as the hammers rang and the saws buzzed, the neighborhood shifted. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, people started talking again, real conversations, not whispered complaints. One evening, as I stood on the rebuilt dock, I heard laughter drifting across the water. A group of kids were fishing. their parents watching from the shore. No one was measuring fence lines. No one was filing complaints about paint colors. They were just living. Karen's empire had fallen. Her title of president meant nothing. Her gavel was useless. And the judge's laugh still echoed in my memory. A laugh at the absurdity of power built on lies. For me, the fight was never about winning. It was about standing. Standing on ground my family had claimed long ago. Standing for truth when someone else tried to bury it under paperwork. Karen thought she could rewrite history with forged signatures and fake votes. But in the end, history wrote her out instead, with handcuffs, headlines, and shame. And as for me, I stood where I always had, by the water, on my dock, with the deed to the lake safe in my hands, and the knowledge that no HOA could ever touch it again. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just the end of a fight. It was the beginning of something new. Because when neighbors see one man stand up, it gives them courage to do the same. And soon, this lake wouldn't just be mine, it would be everyone's safe haven, free from fines, free from fear, free from Karen's grip. The weeks after Karen's arrest felt different, quieter, lighter. For the first time in years, I could walk down my driveway without worrying about a notice taped to my mailbox. The lake looked the same, calm ripples, blue skies, birds circling overhead, but the weight pressing on it was gone. And now it was time to rebuild. The first project was the dock. I hired a crew, but I worked alongside them every day. We replaced rotten planks, sanded the beams, drove in fresh pilings, the smell of new lumber mixed with the scent of the water, reminding me of when my father first built it with his own hands. When the final board was nailed into place, I set a plaque at the end. It wasn't fancy, just a bronze plate mounted on the railing. The engraving was simple, for Dad and Granddad. The lake is ours. I stood there for a long time, running my fingers over the letters. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, gruff but steady. Protect it, Jack. Always protect it. And my father's laugh, deep and warm, echoing across the water. But this wasn't just about me anymore. Neighbors started stopping by, curious about the work. At first they were awkward, guilty even, like they weren't sure how I'd treat them after everything. But I waved them onto the dock, offered them a cold drink, and told them the same thing. This lake is here for all of us. No fines, no threats, just respect. It was like watching a dam break. Suddenly, people who hadn't spoken to each other in years were sitting side by side, fishing poles in hand, laughing like old friends. One Saturday, a group of families gathered with lawn chairs and coolers. Kids splashed in the shallows. Parents grilled hot dogs by the shore. No clipboards, no citations, no Karen. That's when the idea formed, a voluntary lake association. Not an HOA, not a board with power, just neighbors pitching in when something needed fixing. If the dock needed sealing, we'd split the cost. If someone wanted to organize a picnic, everyone chipped in. No rules beyond common sense. At the first gathering, I stood up and told them plainly, the lake doesn't belong to a board, it belongs to us, together. If you respect it, if you respect each other, this place will take care of you. The applause wasn't loud, but it was genuine, and for the first time, I saw hope in their eyes, instead of fear. My own family came back more often too. My daughter brought her kids, their laughter carrying across the water as they reeled in small fish with squeals of excitement. One evening, my wife and I sat on the dock with them, a portable speaker playing soft music while the sun dipped low. The sound of the water, the music, and the children's laughter blended into something perfect. I realized then that this fight, as ugly as it had been, had given us something unexpected. It had reminded all of us what mattered, not bylaws or fines or power trips, but community. Real community, the kind you can't fake with meetings and citations. One evening, Paul, the neighbor who once paid thousands to move his fence, stood beside me on the dock. He stared at the plaque, then at the kids fishing. "You saved this place," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No, I just reminded everyone what it already was." He smiled, the lines in his face softening. "Feels like home again." The dock creaked under the weight of everyone gathered there, kids running, adults laughing, lines cast into the glowing water. The lake reflected the setting sun, gold and silver ripples stretching to the horizon. For the first time in months, I felt peace. Not just victory, not just relief, but peace. Karen was gone. The HOA was gone, but the lake remained, stronger than all of us, carrying memories from one generation to the next. As the last light faded and the first stars appeared, I closed my eyes and listened. The gentle slap of waves against the dock, the music playing softly in the background. the laughter of my grandchildren as they begged to stay just 5 more minutes. I smiled. 5 more minutes, I said. Always 5 more minutes. And in that moment I knew my grandfather had been right all along. The lake would outlive us. But as long as I was here, I'd make sure it was protected. For my family. For my neighbors. For everyone who called it home. Looking back, it still amazes me how far Karen was willing to go. She thought rules gave her power. She thought fear would make people bow down. But rules without truth are just noise. And fear crumbles the moment someone stands up against it. They tried to rewrite maps, forge signatures, and bully me into silence. But they forgot the one thing my grandfather always told me: ownership and truth will always outweigh manipulation. I didn't just protect my dock, I protected a legacy. I reminded my neighbors that no HOA, no self-appointed queen, no forged document can erase what's rightfully yours. And in the end, the whole community saw it. The judge saw it, even Karen saw it, though she'll never admit it. Now when I sit on my dock, watching the sun sink low and hearing my grandkids laugh, I don't think about court dates or forged maps. I think about what it means to stand firm, to guard the ground beneath your feet, to never let someone else's greed define your life. So if you've ever faced a crazy HOA, an entitled neighbor, or someone who thought their rules were stronger than your rights, remember this story. And if you enjoyed hearing it, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to stand your ground against a Karen or a board gone too far. Because at the end of the day, justice isn't about paper, it's about standing firm on what's truly yours.